beginning, the world was under threat by a terrible dragon. Its 7 heads vomited up floodwaters, hoping to drown the world until nothing remained. The Council of Gods was in disarray, overwhelmed by the power of the twisting chaos monster. Finally, one of the younger deities stepped in to make a proposition to the divine council. He would slay the dragon if they promised to make him king over the pantheon. They agreed. The young god armed himself with arrows made of lightning and rode his chariot out from the mountain of the gods. His dark storm clouds rushed over the sea, exploding with thunder as he shot his lightning at the dragon. In the end, the god was the victor. He broke the dragon's body and crushed its 7 heads. This is the story of the biblical God, Yahweh, triumphing over the dragon, Leviathan. And it's the story of the Canaanite god, Baal Hadad, along with several gods in the cultures which surrounded ancient Israel. Ugarit. The biblical narrative claims that when the Creator God, most frequently called by the names Yahweh and Elohim, helped the Hebrews escape their slavery in Egypt, Yahweh promised he would give them a land to call their own, if they promised to worship only him. The world might be full of polytheists, but the Hebrews were to be strict monotheists. With the promise made, Yahweh led the Hebrews to the land of Canaan, where they nearly extinguished the native population and established their own kingdom. Not long after, the Hebrew kingdom faced civil war and split in two: the kingdom of Israel in the north, the kingdom of Judah in the south. Over the next few centuries, the Israelite and Judean kingdoms were repeatedly seduced by their pagan neighbors to worship other gods. Furious at this repeated betrayal of their ancestral promise, Yahweh punished the two kingdoms. First, he had the Israelites conquered by an enemy nation. Later, he did the same to the Judeans. The Jewish survivors eventually resettled their lost kingdom, this time firmly preserving their promise of monotheism. In the early 20th century, archaeologists stumbled across the ruins of Ugarit, an ancient city in Syria. There they found hundreds of texts written in the 14th through 12th centuries BCE. The Ugaritic texts were written in a language closely related to biblical Hebrew, but they were hundreds of years older than any book in the Bible. I'm going to take a quick pause because I'm very excited about today's sponsor, Ground News. You all know my goal is to boost critical thinking so we're not trapped in echo chambers, which I like to call Plato's cave. As this documentary shows, the Bible's demonization of Baal worshippers is an early example of religious intolerance still seen today. The spread of false information can fuel ongoing hatred and intolerance. So what can we do if we crave factual reporting from around the globe and don't want to remain in our little Plato's cave? Enter Ground News. This app and website collects news from over 50,000 different sources, providing a comprehensive view of any given story. We need a tool that helps us see multiple angles, which Ground News does perfectly. For example, there's a current religious freedom report noting rising bigotry amid the Gaza war. Ground News found 55 articles covering this story, and we can easily see that the majority of coverage is coming from the right. We also get information on the factuality and ownership of these sources. It's easy to compare headlines. Lee Enterprises in America writes, U.S. lectures India on alleged discrimination of minorities, while Indie TV in India reports, it's time the U.S., forever preaching to others, got off its high horse. One of my favorite features is how it identifies your blind spots. If you tend to click on articles that lean a certain way, Ground News will show you perspectives from the other side, helping you to avoid echo chambers. It's a great way to get out of our little Plato's cave. If you value critical thinking and unbiased news coverage as much as I do, Ground News is a tool for you. They're offering viewers of my channel a 40% discount on the Vantage plan, which provides access to all these amazing features. Check them out at www.ground.news/myth or scan the QR code on the screen to save 40% on the same Vantage plan I use for unlimited access to all their features. You can find the link in the description or the pinned comment under the video. By signing up, you're not only helping yourself, but also supporting this channel. Thank you, Ground News, for sponsoring today's video. Now, let's dive back into the documentary. Scholars realized the Ugaritic pantheon was the Canaanite pantheon. Rather than only knowing about the Canaanites through the damning reports by their Hebrew conquerors, we had their stories in their own words. What we learned was the so-called biblical religion was far less monotheistic than the Bible's authors might insist. Contrary to the biblical narrative, the majority of historians agree that no such exodus from Egypt happened. Instead, the ancient Israelites and Judeans were a pair of subcultures which emerged within Canaanite society. The Hebrews were Canaanites. They were not monotheists who fell into polytheism. They were polytheist from the very beginning. The precise historical origins of Yahweh are still debated, but on the basis of the evidence from Ugarit, other troves of rediscovered ancient documents, and snippets of stories still present in the Bible, the prevailing theory is that Yahweh worship developed somewhere in Midian or Edom, and then migrated northward into Israel and Judah. Yahweh was initially integrated into the Canaanite pantheon as a storm warrior god, very similar to an existing Canaanite god named Baal Hadad. As Yahweh's followers grew in socio-political strength in the next few centuries, they assigned to him attributes or stories which had belonged to other gods in the pantheon. Ultimately, worship of any deities other than Yahweh was suppressed by cultural leaders. This included attempts to edit the books of the Bible, altering or removing any passage which seemed to contain a positive reference to other gods. The effort was only mostly successful. Digging through the Bible will reveal Israel's underlying polytheistic worldview.
How to respond to disrespect. How to stop people from interrupting you. How to come across less awkward.
Father of the gods. In the Ugaritic literature, we find that at the top of the Canaanite pantheon was El, the deity whose name essentially means just God. El was given a variety of titles. One of these was Elyon, which means Most High. Another was Shaddai, which has traditionally been translated as Almighty. The consort of El was a goddess named Athirat, Ashirat, or Asherah. Together, El and Asherah were identified as the parents of the 70 gods, which comprised the main part of the pantheon. According to this same theological tradition, the human world consisted of 70 nations. so that each god was assigned a nation to rule as their own domain. We see this concept in Genesis 10, which claims humanity separated into 70 nations after Noah's flood. In the Hebrew Bible's historical narrative, which spans the book of Genesis through the book of Kings, we find various poems and songs. Based on linguistic features, some of these poems are considered by many scholars to be the oldest parts of the Bible. One of these is Deuteronomy 32, where we find this statement: When Elyon distributed the nations, when he divided the sons of man, he fixed the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of. The share of Yahweh was his people, Jacob, the portion of his inheritance. In the blank space, different versions of Deuteronomy fill in different words. The common Hebrew text says, sons of Israel. Different Greek copies translated the lines as angels of God or sons of God, disagreeing with the Hebrew version. Other copies of the verse say gods, sons of God, or sons of the gods. What did the text originally say? There was obviously some form of the Hebrew word for God, whether El, Elohim, Elim, or Israel. When the alternate versions are compared and the reasoning behind their differences is considered, the evidence leads us to an original form which says the nations were sorted out according to the sons of El. Amid this assignment of nations to the gods of El's pantheon, Yahweh received the Hebrew nation, here called Jacob. The natural implication is that when this poem was first written, Yahweh was identified as one of the sons of El. He was just one God among many, but the author of the poem in Deuteronomy 32 believed Yahweh was ascending in power and deserved recognition. Praise, O heavens, his people. Worship him, all you gods. The short Psalm 82 also refers to the role of Israel's God within the wider pantheon. Elohim has taken his place in the assembly of El. Among the gods, he holds judgment. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked, Selah? Judge for the weak and the orphan. Give justice for the lowly and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. They do not know nor understand. They walk around in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I say, you are gods, sons of Elyon, all of you. Nevertheless, you shall die like man and fall like one of the princes. Rise up, Elohim, judge the earth, for all the nations belong to you. The author sets the scene. Yahweh, aka Elohim, sitting as a member of the assembly of El, Adat El, close to the Ugaritic term for the pantheon, assembly of gods, Adat Ilm. Yahweh addresses the other members of this assembly, whom the psalm identifies as gods and sons of Elyon. Yahweh accuses these other gods, his peers, of a severe sin. They have utterly failed to enforce justice in the world. Their punishment is essentially a death sentence. Despite being gods, they will die like man, and their nations will be taken from them, given to Yahweh to rule with justice. Comparably, in Exodus 12:12, Yahweh vows to punish the gods of Egypt for allowing the Hebrews to have been enslaved by the Pharaoh. For I will pass through the land of Egypt on this night, and I will slay the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from man to animals, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am Yahweh. The author's message assumes the essential truth of the Canaanite worldview. He does not challenge the idea that nations are ruled by various gods, nor that Yahweh was just one member of the same pantheon. Instead, the central point of the psalm seems to be the author's recognition that Yahweh's following had grown in socio-political strength, resulting in other deities being undeserving of worship. The psalm unwittingly hints at the historical development of Yahweh worship as an emergent subculture within Canaanite religion.
Why burn your time and money on a temporary fix? Many people get
This exaltation of Yahweh over the pantheon is seen in other parts of the Bible as well, though in a less obvious way. The people in the kingdom of Israel and Judah had a large variety of stories about the distant past. These included myths about how the world was created, legends about ancient heroes, and folk tales about noble or clever ancestors who received divine favor. When these stories were brought together and edited into a single historical narrative, the result contained contradictions between the competing traditions, often within the same individual books. According to one tradition, the creator god was exclusively known to humans by names like El Shaddai, or Elohim. Sources like Genesis 1:1, 5:1, 17:1, 28:3, 31:13, 35:11, etc. He revealed his true name, Yahweh, only after he summoned Moses to be his prophet during the Exodus in Exodus 6:2-3. Elohim also spoke to Moses and said to him, I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but I did not make myself known to them by my name Yahweh. This directly contradicts another tradition, which said that humans knew the Creator God by the name Yahweh from the very beginning. The patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob repeatedly call him Yahweh. And when this God summons Moses to be his prophet, he simply identifies himself as the same Yahweh known to the patriarchs. The first tradition corresponds to another historical development within Israelite theology, sort of the next logical step after Psalm 82. Yahweh's followers held on to stories in which their ancestors worshipped the Canaanite god El. Yet, over time, Yahweh's importance within the pantheon was increased until this group concluded Yahweh was actually another name for El. This led to the invention of the claim in Exodus 6 as an attempt to explain the incongruity. This was not a linear process. Some worshippers of Yahweh thought he was El, while others had no such belief. The contradiction between their two versions of the ancestral stories only became a glaring problem when they were combined, becoming the books we call Genesis and Exodus. With the merging of Yahweh and El, this meant that Yahweh was at the top of the pantheon, the God of gods. It could also mean that El's consort Asherah was now Yahweh's consort, but her presence in this role is missing from the Bible. What few references to her exist in the Bible are extremely negative references to Asherah worship. and Asherim ritual objects, somehow connected to her following. Some archaeological discoveries, such as a 10th century BCE cult stand found at Ta'anak, depict Asherah alongside Yahweh, while the 9th century BCE inscriptions found at Kuntalit Adrud mention an Asherah ritual object which belongs to Yahweh. Likewise, with the merging of Yahweh and El, we might wonder if there are other references to the pantheon in the Hebrew Bible than what we've already seen. Genesis 6 opens with the sons of gods taking human women as their wives, and the book of Job begins with the sons of Elohim assembling in front of Yahweh, their ruler. Another noteworthy example is Deuteronomy 4:19 through 20. And when you look up to the heavens, and see the sun, the moon, and the stars, all the hosts of heaven, do not be led astray and bow down to them and serve them, things that Yahweh your God has allotted to all the peoples everywhere under heaven. But Yahweh has taken you and brought you out of the iron smelter, out of Egypt, to become a people of his very own possession, as you are now. For this author, the reality of other gods is taken for granted. Even the worship of these other gods by all the peoples everywhere under heaven is frowned upon or forbidden. Instead, the author's point was only that the Hebrews were uniquely restricted to worshiping a single God, Yahweh. It's the same idea found in Deuteronomy 32, except that the theology has developed to a point where Yahweh is no longer one of many members within the pantheon, but its ruler. Yahweh was the one who assigned the nations to the gods, and he kept the Hebrews for himself. Members of the pantheon. With the existence of the Canaanite pantheon assumed by various biblical authors, readers might expect to find direct references to those gods, at least occasionally, in the Bible. This is exactly the case. There are several passages which disparage the gods of the enemies of Israel and Judah, but there are others which demonstrate that Yahweh was not near as omnipotent as his followers might have hoped. In Judges 1, 3 through 18, Yahweh's promise to help the Hebrews in battle is thwarted by the superior technology of Israel's enemies. Later in 2 Kings 3, Yahweh likewise promises to help the Israelites and Judeans win a battle against the Moabites, a promise he fails to uphold. Why? Because the Moabites offered the right sacrifice to their own God. It appears that Yahweh was outmaneuvered on the divine battlefield by the Moabite god Chemosh. Various Canaanite gods are known through the Ugaritic texts. Knowing their names from these older external sources, we find several of them in the Hebrew text of the Bible, but they have mostly been hidden in the common English translations. In one myth, the storm god Baal Hadad is devoured by Mot, the god of death, though Baal is eventually rescued. The story appears to have been intended to explain seasonal droughts. The rains provided by Baal were withheld because of his temporary departure to the underworld. Similar to the Greek myth of Hades' abduction of Persephone, In Isaiah 25, a prophecy written in the 8th or 7th centuries BCE, flips this myth around. In promising a triumphant future for the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, the prophet declares, "On this mountain, Yahweh Sabaoth will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wines, of rich food filled with marrow, of well-aged wines strained clear. And he will destroy on this mountain the shroud that is cast over all peoples, the sheet that is spread over all nations. He will swallow up Mot forever. Then the Lord Yahweh will wipe away the tears from all faces, and the disgrace of his people he will take away from all the earth. For Yahweh has spoken." Instead of Mot devouring the storm god Baal Hadad, leading to agricultural failure, the storm god Yahweh will himself devour Mot, providing an immense feast for all peoples. Possible allusions to the death god Mot may also be found in Job 18:13. The firstborn of Mot consumes their limbs. Or Psalm 49:14. Like sheep, they are appointed for Sheol. Mot shall be their shepherd. Straight to the grave they descend, and their form shall waste away. Sheol shall be their home. A few chapters later in Isaiah, the author again borrows from Baal Hadad's mythology. Rather than Baal slaying the dragon Lotan, it is Yahweh who will kill Leviathan. Isaiah's description of Leviathan is lifted almost word for word from the myth about Baal, which survived at Ugarit. Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, the twisting serpent. Lotan, the fleeing serpent, the twisting serpent. The dragon Leviathan is mentioned multiple times in the Hebrew Bible, sometimes given the name Rahab. In some passages, Leviathan Rahab is the primordial chaos monster which only Yahweh is capable of subduing. On other occasions, the dragon is minimized as a mere creation of Yahweh's. Two of the more obscure Canaanite deities were the siblings Shalem and Shahar. Shalem was the god of dusk, while Shahar was the god of dawn. The name Jerusalem has been understood by the religiously devout as a Hebrew phrase meaning city of peace. Because of the city's political importance for the Judean monarchy, different scribes came up with competing origin stories for Jerusalem, such as that it only got its name after David conquered the Canaanite tribe which lived there, or that it evolved from an older name during the time of a legendary priest king named Melchizedek. In reality, Jerusalem had been known by its common name for several centuries before the rise of the Judean monarchy, as attested by Egyptian sources in the 14th century BCE, and possibly also the 19th century. Its name is now widely agreed to mean Foundation of Shalem, named for the god of dusk. Where Shalem is found across the entire Bible in an indirect way via Jerusalem, his sibling Shahar is mentioned just once, but in a passage which is clearly borrowing from an older, more elaborate mythology. Isaiah 14, 3-23 contains a prophecy directed against the king of an enemy nation. The king's cruel arrogance earns him a sharp rebuke, and the prophet says the king will die a loathsome death and won't even receive a proper burial. To illustrate just how profoundly terrible the king's fate is, the prophet draws a comparison with a rebellious heavenly being. Many English translations have watered down the mythological allusions made here, and centuries of Christian interpretation have made them even harder to notice. How you are fallen from heaven, Hillel, son of Shahar. How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of El. I will sit on the mount of assembly, on the heights of Zephon. I will ascend to the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like Elyon. But you are brought down to Sheol, to the depths of the pit. The father of the Canaanite pantheon, El Elyon, is mentioned twice. We have three references to the pantheon itself. First, we see the stars of El. Remember from Deuteronomy 4 that stars were thought to be gods? Then we have the Mount of Assembly, which parallels Ugaritic phrases used for the pantheon, group of assembly, and assembly of the gods. Third, the author mentions Zephon, the name of the mountain where the gods would gather, a sort of Canaanite equivalent to Mount Olympus from Greek mythology. The king himself is equated with a figure named Hillel, son of Shahar. Shahar was himself a son of El, which would make Hillel a grandson of El. The exact myth Isaiah borrows from is still lost to us. Scholars have variously suggested connections to the gods Atar, Phaeton, or Halalu, but it was clearly inspired by astrology. Venus, the star born from the dawn, attempts to exalt himself above other stars in the sky by remaining visible even in the light of day. Like Icarus, the minor god's hubris led to his downfall, flying too close to the sun. Isaiah 14 assumes the reader will be familiar with the polytheistic myth underlying his rebuke of the king. Because of the obvious allusion to Venus, Greek copies of Isaiah 14 translated Hillel's name as Eosphoros, while Latin versions called him Lucifer, and Christians began interpreting the human king at the center of Isaiah's prophecy as a fallen angel called the devil and Satan. This misunderstanding of Isaiah 14 blend over into Ezekiel 28, where we find a similar condemnation of a human king through the use of mythological references. Elsewhere still, Isaiah briefly mentions yet another god. Within the Ugaritic literature, we find references to Habi, an obscure god or demon from the underworld who frightens even El. Isaiah 26:20 mentions this Habi as instilling fear. The presence of other gods in Israelite and Judean culture are more difficult to notice in English translations of the Bible without explanatory footnotes. One notable example is Samson, whose story in the book of Judges is a favorite for Sunday school. The titular judges were heroes in Hebrew society, rising up to protect their community from foreign enemies before the establishment of an Israelite or Judean monarchy. Among these heroes, Samson's story is by far the most obviously mythological. His personality, his incredible strength, and his fantastic deeds have frequently earned comparisons to Gilgamesh or Heracles. Like those demigods, Samson's legend even begins with the story of his birth, announced by a mysterious visitor from heaven. Scholars have argued the account shows signs of having been edited, possibly to sanitize an earlier version of the story where the heavenly visitor was in fact Samson's father. Samson's story is set in the vicinity of the town Beth Shemesh, a name which means house of Shamash, the Canaanite sun god. Samson's name in Hebrew, Shimshon, even comes from this god and means something like little son. Samson's enormous strength comes from growing long hair, and ancient illustrations of the sun in this region of the world sometimes depicted the sun's radiance as hair. The chief antagonist of Samson's story is the woman Delilah, whose name comes from the word Layla, which means night. Samson's tragic downfall comes when Delilah cuts his hair. The little sun is defeated when night extinguishes his radiance. Other gods sometimes overlooked in the Bible are deities which protect important people or stand guard over holy places. The prophet Isaiah, living in the 8th century BCE, tells of 6-winged snakes who serve Yahweh's throne in his temple. Royal seals from the Judean king Hezekiah, who was Isaiah's contemporary, likewise show 4-winged snakes. These divine snake guardians in Judean iconography may have been remnants of Egyptian influence on Canaanite culture. Most books in the Hebrew Bible were written or edited after the Judean kingdom was conquered by the Babylonians. These books frequently mention divine beings called cherubs, which overshadow Isaiah's snakes as the protectors of Yahweh's throne and temple. Readers discover these minor gods had faces like humans, but bodies like lions or bulls and wings like eagles. The cherubs were based on Mesopotamian deities called Lamassu, which were engraved on the temples and city walls. Some parts of the Bible also say the cherubs functioned as Yahweh's throne, just as we find engravings of kings sitting on thrones carried by Lamassu. Alongside this, the Hebrew and Greek words for angel both directly translate into English as messenger. An angel was merely a lesser god, running errands for Yahweh, carrying out his orders.
Jordan Orb is a podcaster and YouTuber with over 1 million subscribers. He relies on Riverside.
So if I ever need to film, yes, but we're literally on the other side of the planet.
I'm actually in your bedroom. Just kidding.
Riverside makes tackling
War against chaos. In many ancient mythologies, the universe is not the creation of something from out of nothing. Instead, the universe sort of already exists and must be brought to order. The initial state of the world is quite literally an ocean of pure chaotic emptiness from which the first primordial gods emerged. They create the world by bringing order to the chaos, forming sky and land, then fashioning plants and animals to inhabit those domains. Land is given firm boundaries, which the waters are not allowed to cross. Bless Yahweh, O my soul. Yahweh, my God, you are very great. You are clothed with honor and majesty, wrapped in light as with a garment. You stretch out the heavens like a tent. You set the beams of your chambers on the waters. You set the earth on its foundations, so that it shall never be shaken. You cover it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. At your rebuke they flee. At the sound of your thunder they take to flight. They rose up to the mountains, ran down to the valleys, to the place that you appointed for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass, so that they might not again cover the earth. Often the waters of chaos are personified as a god or a monster. For the Canaanites, Lotan fulfilled this role in his fight against Baal Hadad. But Lotan was actually a servant of the ocean god called Yam and Nahar, names which literally mean sea and river. One of the surviving Canaanite epics tells how, in the early ages of the world, El permitted Baal to become king of the gods after Baal and Yam fought for the position. I tell you, O Prince Baal, I declare, O rider of the clouds, now your enemy, O Baal, now you will smite your enemy. Strike the head of Prince Yam between the eyes of Judge Nahar. Yam shall collapse and fall to the ground. One of Baal Hadad's earliest appearances is in the Epic of Gilgamesh. With the first glow of dawn, a black cloud rose up from the horizon. Inside it, Adad thunders, while Shulat and Hanish go in front, moving as heralds over hill and plain. Seen here with the gods Shulat and Hanish, Baal was sometimes accompanied by other deities when he took action. These lesser gods, such as Resheph and Deber, sometimes show up in the Bible. Yet man is born to trouble, as sons of Resheph fly upward. Job 5:7. You shall not be afraid of terror at night, nor of the arrow that flies in the day, nor of Deber who walks in darkness, nor of Keteb who lays waste at noon. Psalm 91, 5-6. As a storm god, Baal's arsenal for war included his earth-shaking thunder, his arrows or spears made of lightning, and sometimes fire or hell. Coincidentally, the Bible shows Yahweh wielding the same weapons, such as in Psalm 18. Yahweh also thundered in the heavens, and Elyon uttered his voice, and he sent out his arrows and scattered them. He flashed forth lightnings and routed them. The comparison between Baal and Yahweh is impossible to avoid. Baal's mythology predates anything in the Bible by hundreds of years. So the simplest explanation for these similarities between the two gods is that Yahweh's followers copied from Baal's mythology, sometimes word for word, as we saw in Isaiah 27. The historical situation appears to be that when Yahweh worship migrated from Midian or Edom northward into Canaan, Yahweh's followers purposefully adapted Baal's attributes and stories for their own god. This theory may also explain the deep rivalry between the two gods' followers as portrayed in the Bible. With our context firmly established, we find the poem in chapter 3 of the book of Habakkuk. This passage suffers from several scribal errors in the surviving Hebrew and Greek copies. Critical scholarship works hard to make sense of the chapter by seeking to explain where these errors came from, such as letters or words that sound the same or look the same having been mistaken for each other. Other words in Habakkuk 3 are extremely rare, making them difficult to translate because their meaning is so obscure. But when these scholarly studies come together, the picture comes into focus, and the chapter makes a lot more sense. In this poem, the storm god Yahweh, also named Eloah, emerges from his home on his holy mountain in Edom. Yahweh's worshippers are under threat, and he must save them. His thunder shakes the mountains. Yahweh is on the march, accompanied by Canaanite gods of disease and the underworld. There was Hebyon, the strong one. Before him went Deber, and Resheph followed close behind. The people of Cushan and Midian tremble in fear as Yahweh's war party passes by. What is his enemy? Who has threatened his followers? It is Yam, the sea god. Was your wrath against Nahar, O Yahweh? Or your anger against Nahar? Or your rage against Yam? When you drove your horses, your chariots to victory? Yahweh readies his bow to launch poison-tipped arrows. He prepares his bolts of lightning to throw like spears. His storm clouds blot out the sky as the gods of the sun and moon watch Yahweh's battle against his enemies. Shamash raised high his hands. Yarik stood still in his exalted place. Habakkuk 3 was written by an Israelite or Judean author for whom Yam, Hebyon, Deber, Resheph, Shamash, and Yari were as real as Yahweh. And the appearance of this diverse spread of Canaanite gods in such a dense cluster makes it essentially certain the author accepted the existence of the many other Canaanite gods unmentioned in the poem. He had no real reason to doubt they existed. After the Bible. As is the case with all spiritual belief systems, the religion of Yahweh evolved. The perpetual elevation of Yahweh eventually reached a point where he was believed to exist in a category all his own. As the God over all gods, the supreme creator of all things, he had no origin and so had no equal. For the people who believed this, it meant all those other gods were not really gods. Not in the sense Yahweh is. They were one of his many creations, a species we now commonly call angels. Perhaps some of those things we thought were gods were really just demons, the disembodied spirits of dead Nephilim, maliciously pranking humans. Or better yet, those gods never existed at all, except as figments of the human imagination. Ironically, as some Jewish philosophers stress the total and absolute supremacy of Yahweh, they started to think that maybe he was too separate from the angels and humans he made. As the distance between creator and creation continued to widen, these theologians began speculating that some divine hierarchy existed in the gap. Angels were at the bottom of the ladder. Somewhere a little ways above them were those cherubs and many-winged snakes. And somewhere above them were a superior version of angelic princes called archangels in Greek. Yahweh delegated to these princes, these archangels, different parts of the world to rule. When kingdoms on the earth went to war, it corresponded to these angelic princes battling each other in the heavens. But the prince of the kingdom of Persia opposed me for 21 days. So Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, and I left him there with the prince of the kingdom of Persia, and have come to help you understand what is to happen to your people at the end of days. Now I must return to fight against the prince of Persia, and when I am through with him, the prince of Greece will come. But I am to tell you what is inscribed in the book of truth. There is no one with me who contends against these princes except Michael, your prince. At that time, Michael the great prince, the protector of your people, shall arise. Daniel 10-12. They essentially recreated the concept of the supreme god El, assigning the 70 nations of the world to be ruled by the gods of the Canaanite pantheon. Even after this, a few Jewish thinkers continued to speculate about the gap between Yahweh and these angelic princes, because even archangels are Yahweh's creations. The eventual conclusion for these thinkers was that there must exist some being who stands right on the line between God and all that he made, a mediator who represents all of creation to God, while also perfectly representing Yahweh to all of creation. Who could fulfill this role? The answer? Yahweh's own inner wisdom, his creative word, given personal form outside of himself. And the Father who created the universe has given to his archangelic and most ancient word a preeminent gift to stand on the confines of both and separate that which has been created from the Creator. And this same word is continually a suppliant to the immortal God on behalf of the mortal race, and is also the ambassador sent by the ruler of all, saying, "And I stood in the middle between the Lord and you, neither being uncreated like God, nor yet created like you, but being in the middle between these two extremities, Philo of Alexandria, who is the heir of divine things." Yet the desperate need to insist that Yahweh exists in a category of one, far above all creation, resulted in an odd twist. Why is it that he speaks as if of some other God, saying that he made man after the image of God and not that he made him after his own image? Very appropriately and without any falsehood was this oracular sentence uttered by God. For no mortal thing could have been formed on the similitude of the Supreme Father of the universe, but only after the pattern of the second God, who is the Word of the Supreme Being. Philo of Alexandria, Questions and Answers on Genesis. The insistence that Yahweh is wholly unlike anything he created, even his personified word, took such philosophers right back to a form of polytheism. Their pantheon consisted of, at the very minimum, the supreme creator God, a second other God who acted as the supreme God's representative, archangels ruling the world's kingdoms, and an array of angels presiding over different components of the physical universe. While such beliefs may not have ever been accepted by the majority of ancient Jews, the presence of these ideas well into the 1st century CE and beyond contradicts the oft-repeated notion that ancient Judaism was a homogeneous religion expressed by perfect monotheism. But this just raises the question of whether ideas like monotheism or polytheism should even be used when talking about ancient Judaism. Hope you enjoyed this video. This was scripted by Mark Edward. Be sure to check his links in the description. If you like what we're doing here and enjoy these style of videos, please, I could use your help. We need to grow our Patreon and our YouTube membership so that we can continue these projects and you become part of our family. You can get early access to things, and I want to incorporate meetings on Zoom to hang out with those who've joined us. Please like this video so that YouTube recognizes, the pantheon of YouTube will see this is getting attention. Share it on your social media platforms for others to get educated on what's going on in the Bible. And be sure to drop a comment on your favorite parts or even ideas that you have that you thought about during the video itself. If you want to take your learning to another level, mvp-courses.com
The Saturday Swindle, Part 2. In the 4th century CE, the ancient Sabbath was supplanted by Saturday through a change in calendars. The true Sabbath of Scripture was lost. Hillel II, the priestly politician. Constantine the Great, emperor of the Roman Imperium, united pagans and Christians by exalting Sunday as a day of worship for them both. He shifted the memorial of the Savior's death from being commemorated at Passover on the biblical calendar to celebrating Easter Sunday on the Julian calendar. Constantine's son, Constantius, went one step further. He outlawed the use of the biblical calendar for Jews as well. In subsequent years, the Jews went through iron and fire. The Christian emperors forbade the Jewish computation of the calendar and did not allow the announcement of the feast days. Gratz says, the Jewish communities were left in utter doubt concerning the most important religious decisions as pertaining to their festivals. The immediate consequence was the fixation and calculation of the Hebrew calendar by Hillel II. As Constantine was the power behind an action that ultimately led to the loss of the biblical calendar for use by Christians, so another man, a Jew, was responsible for a reaction producing consequences just as far-reaching. Hillel II, the president of the Sanhedrin, adapted the annual feasts to the Julian calendar. He also transferred worship from the biblical Sabbath to the Saturday of the planetary week. Prior to the destruction of Jerusalem, the high priest had been in charge of the calendar, while the Sanhedrin, rabbinical Supreme Court, presided in Jerusalem. There was no set calendar. They would evaluate every year to determine whether it should be declared a leap year. This task fell to the president of the Sanhedrin when the priesthood was no more. Under the reign of Constantius, 337 to 362 CE, the persecutions of the Jews reached such a height that the computation of the calendar was forbidden under pain of severe punishment. In reaction to this situation, Hillel II, in 359 CE, took the extraordinary step of modifying the ancient biblical calendar that Jews and Christians might more easily coexist. Declaring the new month by observation of the new moon and the new year by the arrival of spring can only be done by the Sanhedrin. In the time of Hillel II, the last president of the Sanhedrin, the Romans prohibited this practice. Hillel II was therefore forced to institute his fixed calendar, thus in effect giving the Sanhedrin's advance approval to the calendars of all future years. With Hillel's new calendar system, distant communities would no longer have to wait for messengers from the president of the Sanhedrin to know when a new month had started. Each community would be able to determine for themselves when a new month began and when a 13th month was to be added. When Hillel II fixed the calendar, he incorporated leap years on a permanent basis. It is possible, but not provable, that this particular cycle of leap years was used and understood prior to Hillel, as it follows the 19-year Metonic cycle. Hillel based his calendar on mathematical and astronomical calculations rather than observations. This calendar still in use, standardize the length of months and the addition of months over the course of a 19-year cycle so that the lunar calendar realigns with the solar years. Hillel declared a 13th month to be intercalated in the 3rd, 6th, 8th, 11th, 14th, 17th, and the 19th years of the 19-year cycle. But Hillel did more than make known a 19-year cycle of intercalations that was, in all probability, used all along. He also transferred the observance of the ancient Sabbath from the 8th, 15th, 22nd, and 29th days of the lunar month to every Saturday of the Julian months. This change necessitated another: rules of postponement. Rules of postponement are a set of regulations for controlling when the new moon can be declared. Under certain conditions, the rules of postponement delay the declaration of new moon for an additional day. These rules of postponement are: 1. The Jewish New Year, Feast of Trumpets, may not fall on Sunday, Wednesday, or Friday. 2. If the new moon, or molad, for the 7th month falls on Sunday, Wednesday, or Friday, the new moon is postponed until the following day. 3. If the molad of the 7th month in a common year occurs on Tuesday at 3 a.m. and 2:04/1080 parts or later, the new moon is postponed until Thursday. 4. In a common year following a leap year, if the molad of the 7th month occurs after 9 a.m. and 589/1080 parts on a Monday morning, new moon is postponed until Tuesday. The change of the weekly Sabbath from the lunisolar calendar to Saturday is clearly implied by the needed rules of postponement which, prior to Hillel's fixing of the calendar, had been unnecessary. According to the Jews themselves, the new moon is still, and the Sabbath originally was, dependent upon the lunar cycle. When both the Sabbath and the annual feasts are calculated on the lunisolar calendar, rules of postponement are unnecessary. It is only when the yearly feasts are calculated by one calendar and the weekly Sabbath is calculated by yet another, there are conflicts requiring rules of postponement. Without the rules of postponement, the annual feasts come into conflict with Saturday. For example, if Feast of Trumpets, new moon for the 7th month, were to fall on a Sunday, the last day of Feast of Tabernacles would fall on a Saturday. This would conflict with the traditional observance for the last day of the feast. Hence the need for the first and second rules of postponement. The third rule of postponement ensures the common year in question would not be longer than 355 days. The fourth rule of postponement guarantees a common year following a leap year is not shorter than 383 days. This fixed calendar is highly regimented. There are exactly 14 different patterns that the Hebrew calendar year may take, distinguished by the length of the year and the day of the week on which Rosh Hashanah falls. Because the rules are complex, a pattern can repeat itself several times in the course of a few years and then not recur again for a long time. But the Jewish calendar is known to be extremely accurate. It does not lose or gain time as some other calendars do. This was an act of survival by Hillel II. It was made in response to the brutal persecutions of Constantine's son Constantius. With his own hand, the patriarch destroyed the last bond which united the communities dispersed throughout the Roman and Persian empires with the patriarchate. He was more concerned for the certainty of the continuance of Judaism than for the dignity of his own house, and therefore abandoned those functions for which his ancestors had been so jealous and solicitous. The members of the Sanhedrin favored this innovation. When Hillel II fixed the calendar, he effectually gave permission to the Jews to worship on Saturday for all future time. Only he, as president of the Sanhedrin, could do this. Today, over 1600 years later, the action of Constantine and its resulting reaction by Hillel II are still impacting hundreds of millions of people around the world. Because of these two men, 1. Catholics worship on Sunday in honor of the resurrection. This is in accordance with the Act of Constantine, which changed the observance from a luni-solar calculated Passover to the pagan solar calculated Easter. 2. Jews worship on Saturday because Talmudic law justifies the act of keeping one day in 7 when one does not know when the true Sabbath falls. 3. Most Protestants join with Catholics in worshiping on Sunday, the first day of the modern Gregorian week, assuming it is the day of the resurrection. 4. Saturday Sabbath-keeping Protestants worship on Saturday because it is the seventh day of the modern week, and they assume, since the Jews worship on Saturday, it must be the biblical Sabbath. 5. Muslims, likewise, honor the pagan papal Gregorian calendar keeping by going to mosque for prayers on Friday. It is not possible to find the true seventh-day Sabbath using the modern Gregorian calendar. This solar calendar is nothing more than a pagan method of time calculation. The early Julian calendar was established by pagans for pagans. It was officially adopted for ecclesiastical use at the Council of Nicaea. It was later adjusted by Jesuit astronomer Christopher Clavius at the request of Pope Gregory XIII, hence the name Gregorian calendar. Clavius confirmed the Julian calendar, and thus the Gregorian calendar that comes from it, is founded on paganism and has no connection whatsoever to the biblical calendar. In his explanation of the Gregorian calendar, Clavius admitted when the Julian calendar was accepted as the ecclesiastical calendar of the church, the biblical calendar was rejected. The Catholic Church has never used that Jewish rite of celebrating the Passover, but always in its celebration has observed the motion of the moon and sun, and it was thus sanctified by the most ancient and most holy pontiffs of Rome, but also confirmed by the First Council of Nicaea. The most ancient and most holy pontiffs of Rome, here spoken of, refer to the pagan college of pontiffs of which Constantine, as Pontifex Maximus, was the head. Emperor Constantine desired unity. He achieved this goal through ecumenism and outlawing the use of the biblical calendar for remembering the death of Yahushua. Hillel too desired the physical survival of Judaism. He achieved his goal by compromising with paganism and modifying the biblical calendar. Constantine's action and its accompanying reaction by Hillel has led to the assumption by multitudes that Saturday is the biblical Sabbath and Sunday is the day on which the Savior was resurrected. Thus, Christians and Jews alike have calculated their worship days using pagan solar calendars, neglecting the true Sabbath of Yahweh. None who desire to worship the Creator on his holy Sabbath will calculate worship days by this abomination of desolation that dishonors Yahweh and desolates the soul. Only the lunisolar calendar of creation can pinpoint when the true Sabbath occurs. Lay aside the traditions of man. Accept only the word of Yah. And worship him